After they unloaded all the women brought from the train station, those who had been brought earlier were sitting down without the right to move, surrounded by dogs and guards. They ordered us to stand up and remain straight and motionless. Several dozen men came into the courtyard, probably also convicts, and at the order of the guards we had to strip completely for delousing our clothes. Those men took our clothes, which were our dresses and underwear, as that was all we had on us and with us. They took the clothes to the steam room for delousing, while we were assigned to rooms naked. The cathedral was divided into stacked rooms, and in the rooms there were bunk beds with 4 rows. The beds had been washed with chlorine water and were still wet. The bare, damp wooden boards, and we naked. That's how the prison welcomed us. We were also hungry, as some of the bread given to us in Tighina had gone moldy. Evening came. 3 guards came to count us, making some crude jokes about us being naked. They told us that we would not be given any food that evening, as they were not prepared for so many guests. Nevertheless, we, in our wretched state, more exhausted morally than physically, fell asleep, surrendering our fate into the hands of God. The next day, at 4 in the morning, we were woken by the clanging of heavy keys unlocking the door to our room. They counted us to make sure none of us had escaped. After them, other men arrived. Some brought boiling water in a large cauldron, while others brought 300 grams of bread for each of us. The first day of imprisonment had passed, and we stood naked, shivering from the cold. The second day passed just like the first, especially since every morning they would throw 2-3 buckets of chlorinated water onto our floor to disinfect it, and we had to stand on the wet surface. In the evening, when the inspection came, we began to ask for our clothes. We received a very calm response. "What? Don't you look fine as you are? There are too many of you, and we can't steam your clothes so quickly. Arm yourselves with patience." Every morning during the inspection, a few militia officers would come, put on their gloves, and with their coarse hands performed gynecological and rectal exams on all the women to ensure we weren't hiding any spy notes or other objects. It was something horrifying and unimaginable, designed to make us break down nervously. Every morning, the same inspection, and all of us naked. And even after they brought us the remnants of our clothes, the inspections continued. On the 3rd morning after the inspection, and after they distributed the bread, still 300 grams each, they brought us our clothes in a terrible state. Some were even burned. We were glad to cover ourselves with whatever we had. There were 90 women in the room instead of 60, packed like sardines in a can. When we slept, we could only turn over all at once, as there were 10 women per bunk. I must say that for political prisoners, there were neither doctors nor medications. If someone fell ill, they lay on the wooden boards until, by the mercy of God, they either recovered or died, which of course happened more often. The daily schedule was as follows: waking up at 4 a.m. to receive 300 grams of bread and a cup of boiled water. At 6 a.m. there was an inspection to count us and ensure no one had escaped during the night. Then until 5 p.m. no one came. At 5 p.m., they took one cell at a time to the restroom, which was the only opportunity a prisoner had for these natural needs. And at 7 p.m. another inspection took place, marking the end of our day. We women could sleep as much as we wanted, whereas the men were not given this right. Many women, especially the older and weaker ones, developed diarrhea after a couple of months under such conditions, and since we were only allowed to use the restroom once a day, they placed a wooden barrel in the room for this purpose. This made life even more unbearable. A heavy smell suffocated us, so we asked the guard who stood by our door in the corridor to let us empty the barrel twice a day. After many pleas to the higher authorities, it was approved. We obtained permission to remove the barrel, but none of the women were willing to take it out, considering it a humiliation. Then my cousin, who was imprisoned with me, and I offered to perform this task, believing, according to Christ's teaching, that it is good to be the servant of your brother. By taking the barrel to the pit, which was quite far from our room, and washing it there with a broom soaked in chlorine water, we gained two benefits. One, we got to stay in the fresh air for half an hour, and two, it helped pass the time. Of course, we were escorted by a guard who supervised us, but he was a very kind Ukrainian who would say, "Don't rush, stay in the fresh air a bit longer." In our room there was almost no light, as there was only a small window up high that provided a dim glow, barely allowing us to see each other, and each prisoner was allowed only 10 minutes of fresh air per day. One night I dreamed that the Savior appeared at that small window, crowned with thorns and crucified on the Holy Cross. Blood was streaming from his head around the crown, and Jesus was moving his head from side to side in pain, causing the blood to flow even more. I wanted to go and wipe his wounds to stop the bleeding, but Jesus said to me, "See how I suffer unjustly and innocently?" I woke up. Yes, I woke up from the dream, but I was changed. Jesus had given me serenity, strength, peace, and an undescribable comfort. This dream has stayed with me throughout all the years of imprisonment in Siberia and all my life. I say this even now, after I have left prison, that He, Jesus, supported and strengthened me throughout all the torments and hardships I endured in prison, in the labor camp, and even after I left. One day, while taking the barrel out and washing it, we heard a faint voice calling us by name. We looked around in all directions, but saw no one. My cousin looked up and screamed so loudly that it frightened me. Up on the 6th floor were our husbands. I looked up as well, and through the bars of a window saw the faces of our husbands. They looked more like shadows than persons, weak and pale. My husband, very surprised, asked me, "How come you are here too?" I replied that it was better to be with him than at home. Communication between prisoners was strictly forbidden and severely punished, but our kind Ukrainian guard understood us. He approached us, and I told him the honest truth. He took pity on us and asked us not to say a word in the room, so that neither he nor we would be punished. Of course, we promised and thanked him greatly for his kindness. From then on, we went out with the barrel with greater joy each time, and our husbands would wait for us at the window. When the Ukrainian guard was with us, we spoke with them, but when another guard was present, we only exchanged gestures to avoid being noticed. This happiness lasted for about 3 months. But the pain we felt when, one day, while carrying out our duties, we saw that our husbands were no longer at the window above was immense. We returned to our room very sad. The next day, a few guards came to our room, ordered us to leave our cell on the 4th floor, and moved us to the 1st floor. It was a smaller room because the number of prisoners had decreased due to many deaths. Here, by God's will, we ended up with more Bessarabians. Now we could speak Romanian, as the larger room had more Russian women who did not allow us to speak Romanian. My cousin and I were constantly wondering where our husbands might be. The following evening at 5 p.m., when prisoners were typically taken out for their necessities, we stood by the door and suddenly heard, in our beloved language, "I wonder where our wives are." We replied, "We are here, in this room, right next to you." In the middle of the night, around 1 o'clock, a noise was heard in a corner of the room, right where we were sleeping. I moved closer to the wall and heard my husband's voice. I don't know how the man managed to make a hole in the wall, but we began to communicate with each other. There were 4 of us wives and 4 of them husbands. We spoke in whispers, but we couldn't see each other. My husband asked me, "Tell me, when were you arrested and for what?" I recounted my story, ending with the question, "Why are you surprised they took me?" He then described the torments he endured during the 10 days he was held at the district militia office and the additional 7 days at Tighina. He was accused of spying and having direct connections with Hitler, charges he was expected to confess to. Neither accusation was true, and he refused to sign the document containing these false claims. The interrogations were carried out in the most brutal way, dragging him on the floor and kicking him in the stomach and chest with their boots. They beat him so severely that his kidneys became detached. His stomach and lungs were damaged. He could barely speak and told me, "I don't know how I managed to resist for 16 days, but on the 17th day the instructor showed me a file with my name and said, 'We are tired of your stubbornness. If you don't sign the accusation now, by tonight your wife will be here too.' I was horrified and asked, 'If I sign, you won't touch my wife?' They answered very firmly, 'Of course not,' and I signed, accepting being accused of spying, which carried the death penalty. After that they no longer troubled me, but what good is that? I am an invalid and feel I won't live much longer. I was sure I had saved you, so I am surprised that you are here. It means they have no honor. Please, if they haven't interrogated you yet, don't resist. Sign whatever they give you the first time. Otherwise, they will torment you until you do." Since there were 4 husbands in the men's room and 4 wives in our room, we took turns speaking. We had to be cautious of both the guards and the spies among us, who were Russian women. This continued for a month, and one night around 4 o'clock my husband knocked on the wall and told me, "We are being moved from here, and we don't know where they will take us. Know that we will never see each other again. If God helps you to be freed, please convey my love to our child. Tell him that as I die innocent and in great suffering, I ask him to always be a man of kindness and honesty." With this, our very happy marriage of 15 years came to an end. After that, life became even more difficult for both my cousin and me. Every day, 2 or 3 women from our room were taken for interrogation. They would return covered in bruises, barely able to move. After being allowed a few days to recover, they were taken again and were not released until they signed whatever the authorities demanded. The day of my interrogation finally arrived. I remembered the words of the Savior, "And you will be brought before governors and kings to be judged. Do not worry about what to say, for the Holy Spirit will speak for you." I made the sign of the cross, saying, "Lord, I entrust my life into your hands." They took me out of the room and put me into a black van, a vehicle completely enclosed on all sides, along with several other people, heading in an unknown direction, since we couldn't see anything. It was as dark as night in the van. The guards accompanying us held a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other. We stopped. They removed us from the van, blindfolded us, and bound our hands behind our backs, then led us into a building. We walked for a long time down a long corridor, hearing the desperate screams, moans, and cries of those being interrogated. In a state of indescribable anguish, I finally arrived in a room where my eyes and hands were freed. Then they put me into a metal box where I could only stand. I was locked inside for 4 hours. After that, a guard came and took me to a luxurious office. I found myself in front of a lieutenant in his 50s. I felt a bit relieved, as I had learned from other interrogated women that it was a stroke of luck to be questioned by older men, whereas it was considered a great misfortune if a young man conducted the interrogation. He invited me to sit down. His gun was on the table. He took a large file and lived through it for half an hour without saying a word. After taking a long look at me, he asked why I had been arrested. Calmly, I replied, "I don't know. I'm asking you, since I know I haven't done any harm to the Soviet government." He then said, "It's true that you haven't committed any crimes, but due to the war and your husband's arrest, you have been taken in as a dissatisfied member of the family." He proceeded to write in a large file for 2 hours. During this time, a security major, whom I recognized as a Jewish by his accent, entered the office and asked, "Has she confessed her guilt? If not, close the windows tightly and give her a good beating. You'll see how quickly she'll confess." He left, and I remained like a pillar, motionless and numb. My interrogator then said, "Are you scared? Don't worry. I won't lay a hand on you, as I have no reason to." He then wanted to read to me what he had written. I stopped him, saying, "Don't read it to me. I will sign whatever is written there, even though I am not guilty, because I have no way to prove it. Your power is on the table," and I pointed to the loaded gun. "Even if it's a death sentence, I would be very satisfied." He, taken aback, said, "Why are you so desperate? You're young and have your whole life ahead of you." I answered, "But what good is life to me? My husband is suffering beside me, and our child is left to fate. I wish for death," and I broke down in tears. He said, "You're not guilty of anything. You've been detained because you're a family member of someone who is arrested and who is guilty for having signed. We are at war now. and I'm very sorry for you, but we can't release you. However, once the war is over and we are victorious, you will be allowed to return home." I signed without knowing what was written, and after he rang the bell, the guard came in, led me out of the office, and blindfolded and handcuffed me. They took me out of that dreadful building full of torment, and placed me in a van with those who had been brought with me. Most of them were groaning in pain from their brutal interrogation. When I returned to the prison, my fellow inmates were astonished to see that I had returned unharmed, marveling at my being fortunate with interrogation. From then on, the days dragged on monotonously, following the harsh routine of the Soviet prison. 300 grams of bread, boiled water, no fresh air, and no sunlight. We continued to lose weight daily, but even in our suffering there was a small comfort. Our weakness and hunger made us sleep most of the time. On February 20th, 1942, they removed us from our current prison, dressed in the same clothes we had on, and took us to another prison 40 kilometers from Kazan, in temperatures of minus 40 degrees. When we asked how we were supposed to endure such extreme cold, the response was, "It doesn't matter. Those who can't endure will be followed by a cart to take them to the cemetery. We have no interest in your survival. You are enemies of the people." There were about 300 of us, with a large number of guards accompanying us. We marched in a fast pace as commanded, and those who were ill, weak, or elderly would fall and be taken to the labor camps along the way. We arrived in the village of Sviaj, where a monastery had been converted into a prison. In the courtyard, a control commission held us for about 4 hours. Although we didn't feel the cold on the way, and even sweated a bit, standing in the prison courtyard for so long made us start shivering with cold, eagerly waiting to enter a warm building. We were very disappointed when, late in the evening, we were taken to a large room without a fire and with broken windows covered with straw mats. One small piece of luck was that they had crammed twice as many of us into the room as it was meant to hold. Exhausted, we lay down on the straw mats on the floor, and warming each other like piglets, we fell asleep. With the food, it was the same story as in Kazan. Claiming they were unaware of our large number, they gave us nothing. We endured the cold for 2 days, until they installed windows and managed to make a small fire. As in all the prisons, the routine was the same: a daily ration of 300 grams of bread and boiled water. This was the Soviet prison system's rule. Prisoners had to be hungry and cold. In March, I was summoned to the prison office, where I was given a document to sign. I asked, "Am I allowed to know what I'm signing?" With an ironic smile, he said, "The group of 7 people is sentenced to 8 years in a correctional facility." It was the sentence, but it did not state our crime. The 7 people sentenced were my husband and I, my cousin and her husband, my nephew, an agronomist, and 2 teachers from the neighboring village who were our friends. It looked all so simple and straightforward. We were in Kazan, and the trial was conducted by 3 people in Moscow in our absence. I signed, bowing my head in innocence. We stayed in this prison until August 1942, when we were taken out and loaded into filthy freight cars stained with coal. We were told, "You're going to work now. We fed you enough and you did nothing." And they transported us to an unknown destination. For the journey, each of us were given 2 loaves of bread, black as earth, a small amount of salted fish, and a 5-bucket barrel of water. Once again, we set off without knowing where or why. We were placed together with female criminals who, being stronger, took the bread from the weaker ones and ate it. They did the same with the water. I reached a point where I couldn't eat anything. Due to hunger, I developed pellagra, and my entire body was covered in small sores. I crawled under a shelf, waiting for death, which had become my ideal. I thought the filth in the freight car would cause gangrene, and thus end all the sufferings that lay ahead of me. But everything is in God's hands. He turns death into life, and vice versa. After a week, exhausted by thirst, hunger, and fatigue, we arrived at a train station. From there, we walked about 30 kilometers to a camp for invalids. In the courtyard, guards and a committee of doctors, who were also prisoners, received us. They examined each of us in detail, dividing us into 2 groups. Those who were in better health were sent to recovery barracks, while those who were too weak were assigned to the death barracks. I was very fortunate to be assigned to a young Armenian doctor, about 40 years old, with kind, gentle eyes and a beautiful appearance. She asked me how old I was, and I told her I was 36 and a half. She didn't believe me and checked my file. After confirming that I hadn't lied, she said, "By your appearance, you look 70 years old. Were you overweight when you entered the prison?" I told her that I weighed 96 kilograms. She replied, "That's why you survived. You lived off your fat." She weighed me and found I was down to 45 kilograms. I was constantly dizzy, weak, and powerless. When she asked about my job before imprisonment, I told her I had been a teacher. She then said, "All right, I'll have you work in my hospital." I thanked her. A woman escorted me to the hospital, and I was overjoyed at the prospect of being outside after a year and 3 months without light and fresh air. However, as I walked through the camp's courtyard, I noticed a distressing sight. Many people were blind or insane. When I asked the woman escorting me what this meant, she explained that those who refused to work would eventually go mad. They would dwell on the injustices done to them, survive on just the minimal ration of 300 grams of bread, and ultimately starve to death. The blind people, suffering from both physical and mental anguish, lost their sight, a condition that never healed. I was horrified, but realized that my only chance of survival here was to work diligently. That evening I was given a bowl of soup with a single potato and no salt from the hospital. I couldn't even manage to eat that. Afterwards, they took me to sleep in a wooden barrack with empty shelves.